speaker is Drew Peterson. Drew is a field manager for the Colorado Office of Emergency Management. And he has counterparts that are based all around the state. Drew's area of coverage, he's based in Crested Butte, and he covers Delta, Gunnison, Hinsdale, Montrose, Ouray, and San Miguel counties. This group is a part of the state government that responds to local areas to support local government during different types of hazards or different types of emergencies, ranging from natural to more man-made. Drew was one of the first responders that went to Hinsdale County when the sheriff's house was destroyed, and ended up staying in that area to help the county and the citizens manage the hazard as it went through the avalanche cycle and then into the spring. He brought in Ben Pritchett and myself at times to help, and I think it was a really interesting experience for us to work so closely with a small, close-knit group. We ended up working with counties around the state, but we spent a fair amount of time, not quite as much time as Drew, but a fair amount of time in Hinsdale, and so I thought it would be interesting for everyone to sort of hear his perspective. So please welcome Drew Peterson.
Thank you. I was having this on? There we go. Okay, thanks. I was having a little bit of issue with the earpiece, so I'm going to have to stay here. I'm going to look at this at a slightly different angle. I'm not actually looking at the avalanches themselves, but looking at the aftermath of the avalanches both immediately on how the avalanche occurred and then affected the community, and then sort of more of the long-term or secondary effects. And ultimately, you know, this is some drone footage we shot later in the sort of June-ish of the T Mountain slide in Hinsdale County. And you can just see, sort of like we were talking, there's just total deforestation of the avalanche path. It used to be much more right down in the gully, and it just blew over a bunch of these hills. There's 24 of these up above Lake City. So this is just one path in what it looks like. There's 24 other paths that look like this, and then, as it was talked about, numerous other paths so far. So just to give you an idea, and then you have, you know, you have primary road points up in here where, you know, we have places where the avalanches blew across the rivers in canyons, and that's 200 feet deep right there of snow and trees sitting above the river. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and talk about. I'm going to talk about some of our mission areas too that were created out of this. So how was this different? This was different due to the fact that, you know, as we've talked about, it was broad from a standpoint of geography all across the state of Colorado. And then it was a longer term impact. Generally, when we see avalanches, we see a very pointed impact to maybe an isolated group of folk, either a backcountry user group, rarely a community that has an avalanche path above it, but it's a very isolated occurrence that affects folks. And anytime an incident occurs, people are going to have some kind of recovery they have to go through. If somebody had a car wreck, they have recovery after that car wreck. This avalanche cycle, though, affected a much larger population. You look at, you know, public traveling on I-70. I-70 was closed for hours, which affects all kinds of people. Lake City, they had effects for months after this. So something interesting we've started looking at more, and this classified in this, is multistage emergencies or multistage disasters, where you have one main event and then that creates a cascade of other events directly. We see this a lot in wildfire. You have a wildfire, and then the following summer, the following 2 or 3 summers, you see flash floods. This is very similar, and a little bit about how we look at disasters. Before a disaster, we prepare for it. You know, we educate the public, we do exercises, community messaging, and then we look also at how to mitigate the disaster, what to put in place so that if something occurs, it's either lessened or or eliminated ultimately. This right here is a preparedness event. You're right now participating in Avalanche preparedness for the state of Colorado. Then you have the event occur. When the event occurs, the response begins. People come in, right? The resources come in and they deal with the problem. Generally, that's where it ends. Generally, most incidents last for just a little period. Larger events, wildfires, this avalanche cycle lasted a lot longer and once again had that much more effect on the public. Certain events, as I just stated, create additional events. So this event occurred, and then because of the avalanche paths being bigger and expanding and roads being closed, you suddenly saw all of these cascading events. We knew in March that this was going to cause us problems in the summer during melt-off. We still believe that the problems aren't done. We're going to have problems for years to come, both in the Hinsdale County area, the northern San Juans, and across Colorado, where you've had this gouging. You know, we get a normal monsoon. We didn't have much of a monsoon season this year. We get a normal monsoon season in the San Juans and the Central Mountains, and we're going to start seeing all kinds of flash flooding out of these paths. So a little bit about specifically Hinsdale County. We had the March event, which we've talked about. There were basically two pieces to that event. There was sort of the traditional search and rescue snow removal response. We had to move people, find people, we had to open roads, and then you had the non-traditional response, which was because of the hazard, there were whole areas that needed to be evacuated. Because of because of the transportation routes, food was an issue. You had the psychological stress on the community. This is a community of 400 people, effectively. It swells during the summer, but it's a community of 400 people. There's only 800 people in the county, and that's the entire county. So everybody knows each other. So as soon as you have multiple people having direct effect by avalanches, there's this whole psychological piece that comes in, and we tried to help support that. Ultimately, the support structure for this initial piece was all local run. The locals set up an incident command, they set up their EOC, and then the state the state came in and we helped them sort of through their event with specialists. As soon as I got the call that on the morning of the 12th that the sheriff's house had been destroyed, my first phone call was to Ethan. And I said, hey, we're going to need help in Hinsdale County, start moving resources that way. Because we're going to need that specialty expertise. We also were at the same time working CDOT and making sure that highways were open because we knew we couldn't fly helicopters and things. Ultimately, the public, we had paths reshaped above houses and communities in Hinsdale, which then provided an additional level of stress on everything too, because suddenly you had a community that was fine, and suddenly an avalanche path above them just became, evident, and now they're living with, is this avalanche path the next time it's going to run actually blast through these trees, because there aren't that many left anymore, and actually hit my house? And there's a number of situations like that up there. So that was kind of the first piece of the response there. And there was a limited number of agencies involved. As I said, it was mostly local. Some of the counties, surrounding counties, CDOT, State Patrol, CAIC, BLM, and that was pretty much, how this initial first piece was managed. So it's very, very, very local. Just a little bit about Lake City. This is just a stylized map, but there's two canyons that come into. Go back. Sorry. There's two canyons that come into Lake City: Henson Creek, and then the Lake Fork of the Gunnison River. And both of them end right at Lake City. All of these arrows here were avalanches. There were about 24 avalanches that had serious impacts above Lake City. The interesting piece here is that some of these avalanches and the debris are no more than 10 minutes above Lake City. which presents a problem when it comes to getting people out of the way if there's going to be a flash flood event. So we sort of knew this was coming, from a standpoint of what we had seen. We had a bit of a lull in April where the community was taking a breath from March. They were still really monitoring what was happening. There were still some evacuations in place. There were still area closures in place in April. People were reconstructing homes at that point, or people were relocating the few homes. And I say homes. There was a handful of homes damaged. There was one home destroyed. But it was really a community recovery event at that point, and they were just taking a breath. What did become evident in April is the series of other problems that potentially we were going to start having. And in late April, the largest problem became evident. Up above Lake City, there's two historic dams. This is one of them. This is the Ulay Dam. You also have the Hidden Treasure Dam. The Hidden Treasure Dam has an opening of about 3 feet, had an opening of about 3 feet above the creek at the bottom. And then there was all this avalanche debris up above it. And that really started becoming our problem set. We knew that there was no monitoring above Lake City, just due to the fact there's no communications. So there were no stream gauges. There was nothing to tell us the water was flowing, or more importantly, not flowing. So we started looking into, what can we do to assist in this problem? Here's just some footage of Henson Creek and coming into Lake City. So you can see you have the community. The creek takes a little turn, so the river's pointed right at the community, effectively. There is a little berm that runs down this side of the creek. But you can see that if this river were to have a surge coming down it, it would be highly problematic for the community of Lake City. And high water generally occurs in June, and that's the point at which Lake City has a population of, it starts swelling to almost 10,000 just with, residents and other folks coming in for the summer. So it really does become an issue. We also have a number of bridges up above Lake City. There's a number of small bridges also. And then it hits the fork of the lake fork of the Gunnison River and makes a 90-degree turn. So any large volume of water is going to be problematic. So our two mission areas really became preparedness for the community and mitigation. So on the mitigation front, our mantra was keep the water flowing. And effectively, we started looking basically from upriver to downriver and said, okay, let's look at this problem set. Let's figure out if there's anything we can actually do. This was kind of unique. It wasn't kind of unique. This was very unique in that we didn't really have a great specialist set to say, okay, how do you deal with avalanche debris in a river above a set of dams that's 10 minutes above a town? So we basically just invited anybody who had an opinion and started trying to organize that. And everybody who looked at it, said, wow, that's really bad, is the opinion we got. So, and as a government person, you sort of, as a government specialist and official, you sort of have to say, okay, well, if everybody's telling us this is really bad, we need to take it seriously. And that's what we did. So we started putting, looking at this from really a group risk management perspective. It's kind of like when you're about to ski a backcountry slope and you're sitting at the top and you're having your risk management discussion with your group saying, okay, are we going to do this? Or are we going to go a safer route? What are the benefits and risks here? It was really kind of like that. And we used that process to pretty much figure out what we were going to do with the dam. That's the Hidden Treasure Dam in the middle there. That's the one we actually did some work on, made the holes bigger. And we really used that process well there. We used that process for trying to figure out whether we were going to actually go in and remove debris from the riverways. We used it a little less so in the bridges. The bridges, we just did some pre-staging. And ultimately, we looked at our options and then implemented some solutions. In some cases, we didn't implement solutions. So, then our other side of the coin was community preparedness. And this was going in and getting the community ready for, you know, if something happened up one of these canyons, how do we get the community out of the way? How do we make sure that's effective? How do we make sure we warn them in time? So we went through this process of improving their alert and warning plans and evacuation plans and reentry plans. You know, we looked at the critical infrastructure in the town, meaning the historic district, the power, the water, the bridges, and said, okay, what can we do to protect that kind of, those kinds of facilities? We ultimately ended up sandbagging. I don't know, you know, to this day, I still question whether that was something was worth actually doing or not. It took a whole lot of money and a whole lot of time to do. And we did it. You know, I think this is a place we could have used that sort of group risk management process, and we will in the future. So a lesson learned for us. We're going to more or less use that process in the future to do, before we do things like sandbagging for an event that we don't know is going to occur. If we hadn't done any mitigation, there's a good chance we would have definitely seen flooding. But more than anything, the weather helped us out. It stayed relatively cool well into the summer, which means the melt was way spread out compared to normal. Because otherwise, we were looking at historic levels in the rivers, no matter any way you looked at it. So there would have been flooding. Luckily, there wasn't. So a lot of this piece too was working with the public, you know, talking to the public, making public meetings, making sure they were prepared, making sure they knew, you know, when we said there was a pre-evacuation, that what they should be doing. When we said there was an evacuation, they knew where to go and what they were going to do. So to fulfill these missions, there were lots of partners. You know, I basically said, you know, hey, if anybody has an opinion, we're sort of there at the table. And ultimately, here's all the local and private partners that were involved in helping mitigate and prepare the town of Lake City and Hinsdale County. And then here's the list of state partners and federal partners that were involved. So you look at sort of the initial avalanche, there were maybe 10 agencies, you know, maybe 15 in that initial response. When it came to figuring out how to recover from and then get ready for the next pieces, we were looking at 70 plus agencies were involved, and at some point in time on the ground down in Hinsdale County. To help manage this, we did put in a structure. Initially, the locals were managing it with state and federal assistance, and very quickly it became evident it was going to be well outside their capability. Through a disaster declaration process, the state then got involved officially. The state declared a disaster, which opened some money, and we then could throw a whole lot more resources at it from across the state perspective. So we put a group in place that was somewhere in between an incident command structure and an EOC. Their main goal was focusing on the coordination of all those entities, because that group didn't own any of those entities. Those entities all had their own thing they were doing. We were just trying to make sure that the whole dance was coordinated effectively. And, you know, ultimately, through a lot of good work of partners, we were able to, you know, clear the debris in a number of critical areas in the river. We didn't obviously clear all the avalanche debris out of the river. You know, they're doing avalanche tourism now, actually, in Hinsdale County, where they're actually taking people out and saying, this is what it looks like after massive avalanches. So, so there's still plenty of debris down there, so feel free, go down to Lake City, look at the debris. You won't be disappointed. The roads were cleared. We did do work on one of the dams. We made the hole at the top bigger. We made the hole at the bottom bigger. The other dam, we decided it was going to crumble in itself if a bunch of stuff came down, so it wasn't worth doing anything with. You know, ultimately a bunch of plans were updated and socialized with the public, and alert and warning was improved. So that's pretty much what we accomplished there. So any questions?
Is the state looking at any role in how to, you know, more permanently protect areas like this that have, you know, become obvious that they are in danger, or things like that, like the houses, either due to the houses that now realize they're in an avalanche zone, or houses that realize that they might be subject to the flood effects?
Yeah, so I lost the first part of your question here. It's actually, it is kind of hard to hear up here. But my understanding was, and tell me if I'm right, your question was, if we're looking at how to, put infrastructure in place to better detect and detect avalanches above communities and warn. Was that kind of the?
I'm thinking more along the lines of actual, protection of the communities. Are they looking at how to assist
the
with any?
actual infrastructure? Gotcha. And I was having some discussions last night with some folks here, regarding the, how do you put up structures? What does, in a lot of cases, what's right above these communities is all public land. That can be seen as a good thing, that can be seen as a bad thing, because it creates a level of complication. And, it's nothing that anybody's been seriously talking about yet in these communities, but they're still sort of in early recovery. I think it's definitely, they've definitely been looking at some options though of, can we build walls? Can we put mounds in? What would that actually look like? Who would fund it? And funding's really, none of these solutions are cheap. Ultimately, when you're talking avalanche mitigation, I mean, your mounding is probably the cheapest thing you got. And even that comes with a pretty good cost. So, we will see what happens there, but yes, it's definitely increasing the discussion. There is a lot of mitigation occurring in the transportation world in Colorado. CDOT's putting a lot of money into their structures in protecting our highways and travelways.
Stand up. Coming. Running for it.
Yeah, I may have missed this in your presentation, but I'm just curious, and I didn't catch when those dams were built, but when was the last big flood event to affect Lake City?
So the last big flood event to Lake City was in the 20s, and those dams were built, I forget exactly when the dams were built, but they haven't been active since the 70s, and there's big holes in them because that's how they took the dams out, so they weren't active anymore. But 1921 was the last major flooding event that we have record of. There was some flooding in the 50s also.
Thank you very much, Drew.